In the late 1960s, Hong Kong was a city alive with energy. The streets buzzed with activity, vendors shouting to attract customers, children playing near open markets, and the constant hum of people going about their daily lives. Amidst this vibrant chaos lived a young man who would one day become a global icon. But at that moment, he was just another face in the crowd, trying to make his mark. This young man had recently returned from America, where he'd spent years teaching martial arts and developing his own unique style. Back home in Hong Kong, however, not many people knew him yet. He wasn't the Bruce Lee everyone would later recognize, the movie star or the martial arts legend. Instead, he was simply a passionate instructor, eager to share his philosophy with anyone willing to listen. One evening, after finishing a class, at his small martial arts school, he decided to take a walk through the bustling streets. It was something he often did to clear his mind and observe the rhythm of life around him. Dressed casually in jeans and a plain shirt, he blended into the crowd without drawing attention. His thoughts drifted as he strolled past rows of food stalls, listening to snippets of conversations carried on the wind. As he turned a corner, he noticed a commotion up ahead. A group of people had gathered near a street vendor's cart, their voices rising in anger. From what he could gather, there seemed to be a disagreement over prices or payment. It wasn't entirely clear. Some bystanders were trying to mediate, but tensions continued to escalate. Voices grew louder, hands gestured wildly, and it looked like things might spiral out of control. Being the kind of person who couldn't ignore trouble when he saw it, he moved closer to see if he could help calm the situation. He didn't plan to jump into the middle of the argument. He just wanted to offer assistance if needed. As he approached, though, he realized the tension wasn't limited to the vendors. The crowd itself was becoming restless, adding fuel to the fire. Just then, 2 police officers arrived on the scene. Their uniforms stood out in the sea of faces, and their presence immediately drew everyone's attention. One of them raised his baton slightly, using it to signal for quiet. "Everyone, step back!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. The other officer scanned the area, looking for signs of further trouble. The young martial artist paused, standing at the edge of the gathering. He didn't want to interfere unnecessarily, especially now that law enforcement was involved. Still, he felt a responsibility to ensure no one got hurt. With that thought in mind, he took a small step forward, raising his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Let me help," he said calmly, hoping to defuse the situation before it worsened. But fate has a way of turning intentions upside down. Before he could explain himself, one of the officers misinterpreted his movement as a potential threat. In a flash, the officer swung his baton with surprising speed, aiming to neutralize what he perceived as danger. The crack of wood against flesh echoed through the air, silencing the crowd instantly. The blow landed squarely on the young man's arm, causing him to stagger slightly. Pain shot through his body, but he managed to stay upright. For a moment, everything froze. The shouting stopped, the crowd held its breath, and even the officer froze mid-motion, realizing too late that something wasn't right. Everyone waited, unsure of what would happen next. Would this stranger retaliate? Would the situation explode into chaos? But instead of lashing out, the young man simply stood there, rubbing his arm gently. His expression remained calm, almost serene, despite the shock written across his face. There was no trace of anger in his eyes, only understanding. The crowd watched in stunned silence, waiting for the next move. And unbeknownst to them all, this single act of restraint would change the course of the evening, and perhaps the lives of those involved, forever. The officer who had swung the baton froze in place, his eyes locked on the young man he had just struck. The wooden stick hung loosely in his hand now, as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. He stared at the stranger, trying to process what had just happened. Something about the calm demeanor of the man before him felt off. It wasn't the reaction he expected from someone who had just been hit. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. The crowd stood silent, their collective breath held as they waited for the next move. Would the man retaliate? Could this escalate into something worse? Everyone braced themselves, unsure of how the situation would unfold. But instead of anger or aggression, the young man simply looked at the officer with an expression that was hard to read, calm, yet piercing. Realization began to dawn on the officer. As he studied the face of the man he'd struck, fragments of memory surfaced. This wasn't just any passerby. This was Bruce Lee. Stories about him were already circulating among martial artists and enthusiasts. People talked about his incredible speed, his unmatched skill, and his innovative approach to combat. And here he was, standing right in front of him, not fighting back but simply observing. Guilt washed over the officer like a wave. His grip tightened around the baton, not out of readiness to strike again, but because he suddenly felt exposed. How could he have made such a mistake? He hadn't intended to hurt anyone. He was only doing his job, trying to keep order in a chaotic situation. Yet, in his haste, he had acted without thinking, letting fear dictate his actions. Now, faced with the consequences, he felt a deep sense of shame. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The crowd watched intently, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected turn of events. Some whispered quietly to each other, speculating about what might happen next. Others simply stared, captivated by the tension in the air. Even the vendors whose argument had sparked the entire scene seemed to have forgotten their dispute entirely. Finally, the young man broke the stillness. His voice cut through the quiet like a knife, clear and steady despite the pain he must have been feeling. "I understand you're doing your job," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But violence isn't always the answer." His words carried weight, resonating with everyone present. They weren't accusatory or confrontational. They were honest, thoughtful, and full of meaning. The officer blinked, startled by the simplicity of the statement. Here he was, standing face to face with someone he'd wronged, and instead of yelling or demanding justice, the man was offering understanding. It was humbling, and more than a little disarming. For a moment, the officer struggled to find his voice. When he finally spoke, his words came out haltingly, tinged with regret. "Sir, I didn't mean to hurt you," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought," Bruce interrupted gently, cutting off the apology before it could fully form. "It's all right," he said, his lips curving into a small, reassuring smile. "We all make mistakes." Those few words seemed to lift some of the weight off the officer's shoulders, though the guilt still lingered in his eyes. Then, in a gesture that left the crowd stunned, Bruce extended his hand toward the officer. At first, the officer hesitated, unsure whether he deserved such kindness after what he'd done. But Bruce's gaze never wavered, and slowly, tentatively, the officer reached out to shake his hand. Their palms met, and in that moment, something shifted. Not just between the two men, but within the atmosphere itself. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people processed what they'd just witnessed. Many nodded approvingly, whispering to one another about the wisdom of Bruce's actions. Even the vendors whose heated argument had started the whole ordeal exchanged glances and shrugged sheepishly. The tension that had filled the air moments, ego began to dissipate, replaced by a shared sense of reflection. As the handshake ended, Bruce turned to address the crowd. "Conflict happens," he said, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs. "But how we respond defines us. We can choose anger, or we can choose understanding. Today, let's choose peace." His words struck a chord with those listening, earning nods of agreement and soft applause. People began dispersing, the earlier chaos forgotten as they returned to their routines. For the officer, however, the encounter was far from over. He couldn't shake the image of Bruce's composed face or the calm way he'd handled the situation. Later that night, as he lay in bed replaying the events in his mind, he realized something profound. That brief interaction had taught him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. It wasn't just about martial arts or physical strength. It was about control, patience, and the power of forgiveness. Little did either of them know, this chance meeting would set the stage for a deeper connection in the years to come. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of emotions for the officer. He couldn't stop thinking about the young man he had struck, the calmness in his eyes, the unexpected forgiveness, and the simple yet profound lesson he'd shared. No matter how hard he tried to focus on his duties, fragments of that evening kept replaying in his mind like a broken record. Each time he remembered the crack of the baton against flesh, guilt tightened its grip around him. At first, he tried to push it aside, telling himself it was just another day on the job. After all, as a police officer, he dealt with tense situations regularly. People shouted, argued, and sometimes even fought back. It came with the territory. But this was different. This wasn't some random bystander caught up in chaos. This was Bruce Lee, someone who represented discipline, control, and respect. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, tasked with keeping peace, and he had resorted to unnecessary force against a man who embodied those very principles. The more he thought about it, the heavier the burden became. It wasn't just guilt, eating away at him. It was curiosity, too. Who was this man? What made him react so differently from anyone else in that situation? Most people would have lashed out, demanded answers, or sought revenge. But not Bruce. Instead, he had chosen understanding over anger, patience over retaliation. The officer found himself wondering what kind of person could stay so composed under such circumstances. Determined to learn more, the officer began asking around. He started casually at first, mentioning Bruce's name during conversations with colleagues and friends. To his surprise, many of them knew who he was, or at least had heard whispers about him. Some spoke of his incredible martial arts, skills describing moves so fast they seemed almost supernatural. Others talked about his philosophy, which went beyond physical techniques and delved into mental strength and self-control. The more the officer listened, the more intrigued he became. One evening, after finishing his shift, he decided to visit the martial arts school where Bruce taught. He didn't know what he hoped to achieve by going there. Perhaps an apology, maybe a chance to observe one of his classes. But something inside him urged him to take the step. Standing outside the modest building, he hesitated, suddenly unsure if this was the right thing to do. What if Bruce didn't want to see him? What if he was unwelcome? Taking a deep breath, the officer pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was alive with energy. Students moved gracefully across the floor, their movements synchronized and precise. In the center of it all stood Bruce, guiding them with quiet authority. His voice carried clearly through the space, offering instructions and encouragement. For a moment, the officer simply watched, mesmerized by the fluidity and focus of the practice. When the session ended, Bruce noticed the officer standing near the doorway. Their eyes met briefly, and for a second, the officer felt a pang of anxiety. Would Bruce remember him? Would he be angry? But then Bruce smiled, a small, genuine smile, and walked over to greet him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Bruce said, his tone warm and welcoming. There was no trace of resentment in his voice, only openness. The officer shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. I wanted to apologize," he finally managed to say, his words tumbling out awkwardly. "What happened that night? It shouldn't have. I acted without thinking, and I regret it." Bruce nodded slowly, studying the officer's face. "Regret is natural," he replied, "but holding on to it doesn't serve anyone. What matters is what you do next." His words hit the officer like a punch to the chest, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Regret was weighing him down, but Bruce was offering him a way out, a chance to grow. Inspired by the simplicity of the advice, the officer took a step forward, both literally and figuratively. "Can I stay?" he asked hesitantly. "To watch? Maybe even learn?" Bruce's smile widened slightly. "Everyone starts somewhere," he said. "Why not here?" And so, the officer stayed. At first he watched from the sidelines, observing the techniques and listening to Bruce's teachings. Over time, though, he began participating, learning the basics of martial arts alongside the other students. It wasn't easy. There were moments when frustration bubbled to the surface, especially when he struggled to master certain moves. But Bruce always encouraged him, reminding him that progress came with patience. Through these sessions, the officer discovered something unexpected. Martial arts weren't just about fighting. They were about balance, discipline, and understanding oneself. Every punch, every kick, every block carried meaning beyond the physical act. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the dojo, shaping the way he approached life and his role as a police officer. As weeks turned into months, the two men developed an unlikely friendship. They often spoke after class, sharing stories and exchanging ideas. The officer learned about Bruce's vision of martial arts as a tool for personal growth, while Bruce gained insight into the challenges faced by law enforcement officers. Both men grew from the experience, finding common ground despite their vastly different worlds. For the officer, this journey marked a turning point. He realized that the night he had swung his baton in haste wasn't just a mistake. It was a wake-up call. It forced him to confront his own biases, fears, and limitations. And thanks to Bruce's guidance, he emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than ever before. As the weeks went by, the officer found himself looking forward to his visits to Bruce's martial arts school. What had started as a hesitant attempt to make amends had turned into something much deeper, a journey of self-discovery. Each class brought new challenges but also new insights. He was no longer just learning how to throw a punch or block an attack. He was learning how to think differently, act with intention, and approach life with clarity. At first, the physical aspect of training was daunting. Years of desk work and standing patrol shifts had left him out of shape, and keeping up with the younger students wasn't easy. His muscles ached after every session, and there were days when he felt like giving up. But Bruce never let him quit. Instead, he encouraged him gently, reminding him that progress came not from perfection but from persistence. "You don't have to be the best," Bruce would say. "You just have to be better than you were yesterday." This mindset resonated deeply with the officer. It wasn't about being flawless, it was about growth. Slowly but surely, he began to see improvements, not just in his technique but in his confidence and focus too. The dojo became a place where he could leave behind the stress of his job and immerse himself in something meaningful. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. But the lessons extended far beyond the mats. During breaks between classes, Bruce and the officer often sat together, sharing stories over cups of tea. These conversations revealed a side of Bruce that many people didn't get to see. The philosopher, the thinker, the man who believed in using martial arts as a tool for personal transformation. He spoke passionately about the importance of balance, not just in combat, but in life itself. "Strength without control is dangerous," Bruce explained one evening, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. "It's like holding a sword without knowing how to wield it. You might hurt others, or worse, yourself. True power comes from understanding your limits and respecting them." The officer nodded thoughtfully, absorbing every word. He realized that this philosophy applied not only to martial arts but also to his role as a police officer. How many times had he acted out of instinct or frustration, letting emotions cloud his judgment? Bruce's words made him reflect on his own behavior, how he handled conflicts, how he interacted with the public, and how he carried himself under pressure. One day, during a particularly intense sparring session, the officer found himself face to face with a younger student who was quick on his feet. No matter what he did, he couldn't land a single blow. Frustration bubbled up inside him, and for a moment, he considered throwing caution to the wind and charging recklessly. But then he remembered Bruce's advice. Control your emotions. Don't let anger guide your actions. Taking a deep breath, he stepped back, reassessing the situation. Instead of rushing blindly, he waited patiently for the right moment to strike. When the opportunity finally came, he moved swiftly and decisively, landing a clean hit. The other student grinned, acknowledging the point, and the officer felt a surge of pride. Not because he'd won, but because he'd stayed calm under pressure. Afterward, Bruce approached him with a smile. "That was good," he said. "You controlled your temper, and it paid off. Remember, fighting isn't about overpowering someone. It's about finding harmony within yourself." These moments of reflection became a cornerstone of the officer's training. With each passing week, he noticed subtle changes in the way he carried himself, not just in the dojo but in his daily life as well. He became more patient when dealing with difficult situations at work, more empathetic when interacting with the public, and more mindful of his own reactions. Martial arts weren't just shaping his body, they were reshaping his mind. Word of the officer's dedication began to spread among the students. At first, some were skeptical. After all, why would a police officer want to learn martial arts? But as they watched him train, they saw the sincerity in his efforts and the respect he showed toward everyone around him. Over time, he earned their trust and admiration, becoming part of the tight-knit community that Bruce had built. For Bruce, seeing the officer's transformation was deeply rewarding. He often reminded his students that martial arts weren't meant to create fighters, they were meant to create better human beings. Watching the officer embrace this philosophy reinforced his belief in the power of teaching. Every punch thrown, every lesson taught, had the potential to change someone's life, including his own. Their bond grew stronger with each passing month. Outside of class, they continued to share ideas and experiences, discussing everything from philosophy to personal struggles. The officer opened up about the pressures of his job, while Bruce talked about the challenges of pursuing a dream in a world that often misunderstood him. Through these exchanges, they discovered that despite their differences, they shared a common goal: to make the world a little better, one small step at a time. One evening, as they walked home together after class, the officer stopped suddenly and looked at Bruce. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know if I've said that enough, but thank you. You didn't have to help me, but you did, and it's changed everything." Bruce smiled softly, placing a hand on the officer's shoulder. "We're all teachers and students in this life," he replied. "Sometimes we teach through words, and sometimes we teach through actions. That night you taught me something too, that even in our mistakes there's an opportunity to grow." The officer nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. In that moment, he realized that their friendship wasn't just about forgiveness or redemption, it was about connection. Two very different men, brought together by chance, had found common ground and inspired each other to become better versions of themselves. Little did they know, their story was just beginning. As time passed, the bond between the officer and Bruce grew stronger, evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. What began as an awkward attempt at reconciliation had blossomed into a genuine friendship, one that transcended their differences and brought out the best in both men. Their shared journey became a testament to how human connection can bridge even the widest gaps. The officer's transformation didn't go unnoticed by his colleagues at the police station. At first, they teased him lightly about his newfound hobby, joking that he was trading his baton for nunchucks. But as weeks turned into months, they began to see real changes in him. He was calmer under pressure, more thoughtful in his decisions, and less reactive during tense situations. His demeanor softened, and he approached conflicts not with force but with understanding, a shift that earned him respect among his peers. One day, while on patrol, the officer found himself facing a familiar scenario: a heated argument between two street vendors over parking space. In the past, he might have raised his voice or used his authority to intimidate them into silence. But this time, he took a different approach. Drawing from what he'd learned in the dojo, he stepped between the two men and spoke calmly, urging them to listen to each other instead of shouting. To everyone's surprise, the argument dissolved quickly, leaving both parties shaking hands and apologizing. When word of this incident reached Bruce, he couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just pride he felt, it was validation. His teachings were making a difference, not only in the lives of his students but also in the community at large. Martial arts weren't confined to the mats. They were tools for creating harmony, wherever chaos threatened to take hold. Inspired by the officer's progress, Bruce decided to incorporate more real-life examples into his classes. He often used stories from their shared experiences to illustrate key lessons, showing his students how martial arts principles could be applied beyond physical combat. True strength isn't about overpowering others, he would say. It's about knowing when not to fight and finding solutions that benefit everyone. These discussions sparked lively debates among the students, many of whom came from diverse backgrounds. Some were young athletes eager to prove themselves, while others were older individuals seeking balance and discipline. Regardless of their reasons for joining, they all left each session with a deeper understanding of themselves and the world around them. Meanwhile, the officer continued to immerse himself in training, pushing his limits further with every class. Though he still struggled with certain techniques, especially those requiring speed and agility, he refused to let frustration get the better of him. Instead, he embraced the challenge, viewing it as an opportunity to grow. Bruce noticed this change and often praised him for his perseverance, reminding the class that true mastery came not from natural talent, but from relentless effort. Their friendship deepened through these shared struggles and triumphs. On weekends, they sometimes went for long walks through the city, discussing everything from philosophy to personal dreams. These conversations revealed new facets of their personalities. The officer discovered that beneath Bruce's confident exterior lay a man driven by curiosity and humility. For his part, Bruce admired the officer's willingness to confront his flaws and strive for improvement, a quality he believed was essential for growth. During one such walk, the officer confessed something that had been weighing on his mind. "You know," he said hesitantly, "I used to think being strong meant never backing down, that if I showed weakness, people would lose respect for me. But now, I realize strength is about admitting when you're wrong and doing what's right even if it's hard." Bruce nodded thoughtfully, his pace slowing slightly as he processed the words. "That's wisdom," he replied. "Strength isn't about domination, it's about integrity. When you stand by your values, even in the face of fear or doubt, that's when you truly become unstoppable." These moments of vulnerability strengthened their connection, turning their relationship into something rare and profound. They weren't just teacher and student anymore. They were allies on a shared path toward self-improvement. And as their bond grew, so did their impact on those around them. Word of their unlikely friendship spread throughout the neighborhood, inspiring others to rethink their own assumptions. People who had once viewed police officers with suspicion began to see them in a new light, recognizing the humanity behind the uniform. Similarly, Bruce's reputation as a martial artist expanded beyond his skills to include his role as a peacemaker and mentor. Together, they became symbols of hope in a city that often felt divided. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, the officer sat cross-legged on the floor of the dojo, wiping sweat from his brow. Bruce joined him, handing over a cup of tea with a knowing smile. "You've come a long way," he said softly. "Do you remember the first time you walked in here?" The officer chuckled, shaking his head. "How could I forget? I was nervous, unsure of myself, and honestly, a little scared. I didn't know what to expect." "And now?" Bruce asked, raising an eyebrow playfully. "Now?" The officer paused, looking around at the bustling room filled with students practicing their forms. "Now, I feel like I belong. Like I'm part of something bigger than myself." Bruce's expression softened, his eyes reflecting a mix of pride and gratitude. That's what martial arts are meant to do, to bring people together, to remind us that we're all connected. No matter where we come from or what we do, we're all searching for the same thing: purpose. The officer nodded, sipping his tea in silence. As he looked at Bruce, he realized how much this man had taught him, not just about fighting, but about living. Every lesson, every conversation, every moment of laughter or struggle had shaped him into someone he barely recognized anymore, someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. But their journey was far from over. Little did they know, The lessons they were learning would soon be put to the test in ways neither of them could have predicted. The streets of Hong Kong were ever-changing, and challenges lay ahead that would require every ounce of strength, patience, and understanding they had cultivated together. Yet, as they sat there side by side, surrounded by the hum of activity, they faced the future with quiet confidence. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as teacher and student, as friends and as partners in the pursuit of a better world. The bond between the officer and Bruce had grown into something solid, but it was about to face its toughest test yet. Life in Hong Kong wasn't predictable, it never had been, and just when things seemed to settle into a rhythm, chaos found a way to creep back in. This time it came in the form of a large protest brewing in one of the city's busiest districts. Tensions had been rising for weeks. Workers were unhappy with new regulations that threatened their livelihoods, and small business owners felt ignored by the government. What started as peaceful demonstrations quickly escalated into loud, heated protests. People gathered in droves, holding signs and chanting slogans, demanding change. The air buzzed with frustration and anger, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the situation turned volatile. The officer was assigned to patrol the area, tasked with maintaining order alongside his fellow officers. He dreaded it. After months of training under Bruce, he no longer saw conflict as something to suppress with force. Instead, he understood that true resolution required patience and dialogue. But how could he explain that to his superiors? How could he convince them that shouting commands or brandishing batons wouldn't solve anything? As he prepared for duty, he couldn't help but think about Bruce's teachings. Conflict happens, Bruce had said once, but how we respond defines us. Those words echoed in his mind as he strapped on his uniform and checked his equipment. For the first time in years, he felt torn between his role as an officer and the person he was becoming, a man who valued understanding over authority. When he arrived at the scene, the crowd was already restless. Hundreds of people filled the streets, their voices rising in unison like a storm building on the horizon. Some carried banners, others held megaphones, and a few stood silently, their expressions heavy with emotion. The atmosphere was tense, charged with energy that could erupt at any moment. Officers lined up along the edges of the crowd, their faces stern, their hands resting near their batons. The officer scanned the sea of faces, searching for a way to defuse the situation before it spiraled out of control. His heart raced as memories of past confrontations flashed through his mind, times when he'd acted too quickly, too harshly, letting fear dictate his actions. Not this time, he told himself. This time would be different. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, raising his hands to signal for calm. "Listen," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "We're here to hear you out, not to fight. Let's talk." For a moment the crowd hesitated, shouts quieted and heads turned toward him. It was a small victory, but it gave him hope. He continued speaking, his tone steady and sincere. "I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. But violence won't fix anything. Let's find a way to work together." His words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. A few protesters nodded, murmuring their agreement, while others remained skeptical, their eyes narrowed with distrust. Still, the tension eased slightly, giving everyone a chance to breathe, but not everyone was willing to listen. From the back of the crowd, a young man pushed his way forward, his face flushed with anger. "Why should we trust you?" he demanded, pointing accusingly at the officer. "You're just going to arrest us anyway." The accusation stung, but the officer didn't flinch. He met the young man's gaze, holding it firmly without hostility. "I can't promise you won't get arrested," he admitted. "But I can promise that I'll do everything I can to make sure your voice is heard. That's why I'm here. To listen, not to fight." The young man faltered, caught off guard by the honesty in the officer's response. For a brief moment, the two locked eyes, neither backing down. Then slowly, the protester lowered his hand, stepping back into the crowd. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. Others followed suit, lowering their signs and calming their voices. Behind the scenes, however, not all officers shared the same approach. One of the senior officers, frustrated by the lack of immediate compliance, ordered his team to move in and disperse the crowd. Batons were drawn, and shouts of "Step back" filled the air. Panic rippled through the protesters, and the fragile peace began to crumble. The officer watched in horror as the situation deteriorated. Despite his efforts, chaos was taking over. Protesters pushed against the line of officers, their earlier restraint replaced by fear and anger. The sound of scuffling feet and raised voices drowned out any attempts at communication. In the midst of the commotion, the officer spotted the young man from earlier being shoved roughly by another officer. Instinctively, he rushed forward, placing himself between them. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice firm but controlled. "This isn't helping anyone." The other officer glared at him, clearly annoyed. "Get out of the way," he snapped. "They need to learn respect." "They will," the officer replied, standing his ground. "But not like this." For a moment, it looked like the confrontation might escalate further. Both officers stared each other down, surrounded by the chaos of the protest. Then unexpectedly, the senior officer backed off, muttering under his breath as he returned to his post. The young man, wide-eyed and shaken, muttered a quick "thank you" before disappearing into the crowd. When the dust finally settled and the protesters dispersed, the officer felt drained, physically and emotionally. He had done what he could to prevent violence, but the scars of the day lingered. As he walked home that evening, replaying the events in his mind, he realized how much Bruce's teachings had shaped his decisions. Without them, he might have reacted differently, perhaps even contributed to the chaos instead of trying to stop it. Later that night, unable to sleep, he decided to visit Bruce. Though it was late, he knew Bruce often stayed up practicing or reading. Sure enough, he found him in the dojo, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a book in hand. When the officer entered, Bruce looked up, immediately sensing the weight on his friend's shoulders. "What happened?" Bruce asked gently, setting the book aside. The officer sighed, sinking onto the mat beside him. "It was messy," he admitted. "I tried to keep things calm, but it got out of hand. I don't know if I did enough, or if I even made a difference." Bruce listened quietly as the officer recounted the events of the day, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When the story ended, he leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You did more than you realize," he said finally. "Peace isn't built in a single day. Sometimes it's the smallest actions, the ones that go unnoticed, that plant the seeds for change." The officer frowned, unsure if he believed it. "But so much went wrong," he insisted. "People were hurt, scared. How is that progress?" "Progress isn't always visible," Bruce replied. "Think about the young man you protected. You showed him that not all officers are the same. That matters. And think about your colleagues. They saw you stand up for what you believe in. Maybe next time, they'll think twice before acting out of fear." These words struck a chord. The officer hadn't considered the ripple effects of his actions. In focusing on the immediate outcome, he'd overlooked the subtle ways his choices might influence others. Slowly, he began to feel a sense of relief, not because everything had gone perfectly, but because he had stayed true to his values. As the night wore on, the two men sat together in silence, reflecting on the challenges ahead. They both knew the road to harmony wouldn't be easy, especially in a city as dynamic as Hong Kong. But they also knew they weren't alone. Together, they had created something rare and meaningful, a partnership rooted in mutual respect and a shared vision for a better future. And though the battle for peace was far from over, they faced it with unwavering determination. After all, every step forward, even the smallest ones, counted. The aftermath of the protest left a deep mark on the officer. He couldn't shake the images from his mind, the shouting, the shoving, the fear in people's eyes. It wasn't just the chaos that haunted him. It was the realization of how thin the line between order and disorder truly was. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and everything could spiral out of control. But what troubled him most was the nagging question. Had he done enough? Could he have done more? Bruce noticed the change in him almost immediately. The officer, who had once walked into the dojo with growing confidence, now seemed weighed down by doubt. His movements during practice lacked their usual energy, and his focus wavered. Bruce didn't push him to talk about it right away. Instead, he gave him space, knowing that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. One evening, after a particularly quiet training session, Bruce approached the officer as he sat alone on the mat, staring at the floor. "You're carrying something heavy," Bruce said softly, sitting down beside him. "Want to share it?" The officer hesitated, unsure where to begin. Finally, he sighed and looked up. "I keep thinking about that day," he admitted. "About all the things I couldn't fix. No matter what I did, it felt like I was swimming against the tide. Like nothing I tried made a real difference." Bruce nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "It's easy to feel powerless when you're faced with something bigger than yourself. But remember this: every action has ripples. You might not see them right away, but they're there." The officer frowned, leaning back on his hands. "Ripples, huh? That sounds nice in theory, but how does it help when you're standing in the middle of a storm?" Bruce smiled faintly, tilting his head. "Let me ask you this. Do you think the young man you protected has forgotten what you did for him?" The question caught the officer off guard. He hadn't thought about the protester since that night, not consciously anyway. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "Maybe, maybe not. Either way, it doesn't change the bigger picture." "Ah, but it does," Bruce countered gently. "Every person you touch carries a piece of that moment with them. They remember how you acted, how you spoke, how you chose to respond. And those memories shape the way they interact with others. That's how ripples work. They spread without us even realizing it." The officer mulled over these words, letting them sink in. He wanted to believe Bruce was right, but it was hard to see past the frustration and exhaustion that clung to him like a shadow. Still, there was something comforting about the idea that even small actions mattered, that kindness, no matter how fleeting, could leave a lasting impact. Over the next few weeks, the officer threw himself back into training with renewed determination. If he couldn't control the world around him, he could at least focus on improving himself. Each punch, each kick, each block became an opportunity to channel his frustrations into growth. Bruce watched proudly as the officer pushed through, his limits refusing to let setbacks discourage him. But life outside the dojo continued to test him. Another incident arose, a minor scuffle near a market that escalated quickly. This time, however, the officer handled it differently. Drawing on what he'd learned, he stepped in early, using calm words and steady body language to diffuse the tension before it turned violent. When bystanders began to gather, curious and wary, he addressed them directly, explaining the situation clearly and reassuring them that he was there to help, not harm. To his surprise, the approach worked. The crowd dispersed peacefully, and the individuals involved apologized to each other before going their separate ways. As the officer walked back to his patrol car, he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that progress, however small, was still progress. Word of his efforts began to spread among the community. People started recognizing him, not as just another cop, but as someone who genuinely cared. Shopkeepers greeted him warmly, parents thanked him for keeping their streets safe, and even some former protesters acknowledged his willingness to listen. These moments of connection reminded him why he had joined the force in the first place, to make a difference however imperfectly. Meanwhile, Bruce continued to challenge him, not just physically, but mentally. During breaks between classes, they delved deeper into philosophical discussions, exploring questions about leadership, responsibility, and the nature of strength. One day, as they sipped tea together, Bruce posed a question that lingered in the officer's mind long after their conversation ended. "What do you fight for?" Bruce asked, his tone casual yet probing. The officer blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, why do you put on that uniform every day? Why do you step into the chaos knowing it might cost you? Is it duty, pride, or is it something else?" The question struck a nerve. For years, the officer had worn the badge because it was expected of him, because it was stable, respectable work. But now, as he reflected on his journey, he realized his reasons had shifted. "I guess I fight for balance," he said finally. "For peace. Not just on the streets, but within myself. I want to be someone who makes things better, not worse." Bruce smiled, nodding approvingly. "That's a good answer. Remember it when the storms come again, and they will. Knowing your why gives you strength when everything else feels uncertain." Their conversations often circled back to this theme, finding purpose in the midst of struggle. Through Bruce's guidance, the officer came to understand that being a leader wasn't about having all the answers. It was about staying grounded, even when the ground beneath you shook. It was about choosing compassion over anger, patience over haste, and understanding over judgment. As months passed, their bond deepened further. The officer introduced Bruce to some of his colleagues, hoping to share the lessons he'd learned. At first, many were skeptical, dismissing martial arts as irrelevant to their work. But as they witnessed the officer's transformation firsthand and heard stories of his success in de-escalating conflicts, they began to take notice. A few even joined him for classes, eager to experience the discipline and wisdom Bruce offered. Through these interactions, a bridge formed between two worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. Police officers and martial artists, strangers and friends, all came together under one roof, united by a shared goal: to create harmony in a fractured city. It wasn't always smooth sailing, but every step forward brought them closer to that vision. Looking back, the officer marveled at how far he'd come. What had started as a single mistake, a baton strike born of fear, had blossomed into a journey of self-discovery, friendship, and service. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. Together, he and Bruce had planted seeds of change, trusting that time and effort would bring them to fruition. And though challenges loomed on the horizon, they faced them with courage, knowing that every ripple counted. Because in the end, it wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence, about showing up day after day and doing the best you could with what you had. That, they realized, was the true measure of strength. Months turned into years, and the bond between Bruce and the officer only grew stronger. What had begun as an accidental meeting born out of conflict had transformed into a lifelong friendship, one that left a lasting mark on both men and the world around them. Their journey wasn't just about personal growth, it was about creating ripples of change that touched countless lives. The officer became a role model within his department. His colleagues noticed how he handled tense situations with calmness and empathy, often diffusing conflicts before they escalated. He shared stories from the dojo during team meetings, emphasizing the importance of patience, self-control, and understanding. Slowly but surely, his approach began to influence others. Some officers started attending Bruce's classes themselves, eager to learn not just martial arts techniques, but also the philosophy behind them. Bruce, too, found inspiration in their partnership. Watching the officer apply his teachings in real-world scenarios reinforced his belief in the power of martial arts as a tool for transformation. He incorporated more practical examples into his lessons, using their experiences to illustrate key principles. Martial arts aren't just for fighting, he would say. They're for living. Every moment is an opportunity to practice balance, discipline, and compassion. Their collaboration extended beyond the dojo and the streets. Together, they organized workshops aimed at fostering better communication between law enforcement and the community. These events brought police officers and civilians together in open dialogue, breaking down barriers and building trust. At first, tensions ran high, old grievances surfaced, and mistrust lingered. But over time, genuine connections formed. People realized they weren't so different after all. They shared common hopes, fears, and dreams. One such workshop stood out in particular. It took place in a small community center, packed with people from all walks of life. Officers sat side by side with local residents, listening intently as each group voiced their concerns. The atmosphere was charged, but this time, instead of anger, there was a sense of shared purpose. Bruce facilitated the discussion, guiding participants through exercises designed to promote empathy and mutual respect. At one point, a young woman stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. She recounted how her brother had been wrongfully detained during a protest, describing the fear and helplessness she felt. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed her words. Then, unexpectedly, an officer raised his hand and spoke. "I hear you," he said simply, "and I'm sorry. We can do better, and we will." The sincerity in his voice moved many to tears. For the first time, the young woman felt heard, not dismissed or judged, but truly understood. That moment became a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone present. Walls began to crumble, replaced by bridges built on honesty and vulnerability. As these initiatives gained traction, word spread throughout Hong Kong. Media outlets picked up the story, highlighting the unlikely friendship between a martial artist and a police officer. Interviews aired on television, articles appeared in newspapers, and soon, their message reached far beyond the city limits. People around the world were inspired by their example, proving that even in divided times, unity was possible. But fame didn't change either man. Bruce remained humble, focusing on his students and his craft. The officer continued his work on the streets, striving to make a difference one interaction at a time. They both understood that true impact came not from recognition but from consistent, heartfelt effort. Years later, when Bruce achieved global fame as a martial arts legend and movie star, he never forgot the lessons he'd learned alongside the officer. In interviews, he often credited their friendship as a cornerstone of his philosophy. "Strength isn't about dominating others," he'd say. "It's about lifting them up. Every punch we throw, every decision we make, it shapes the world we live in." For the officer, the journey was equally transformative. He retired from the force decades later, leaving behind a legacy of compassion and integrity. On his last day, colleagues and community members gathered to honor him, sharing stories of how he had touched their lives. One elderly vendor summed it up best. "He taught us that peace isn't something you wait for. You create it with kindness, patience, and courage." Even in retirement, their friendship endured. Now older and grayer, they still met regularly at the dojo, reminiscing about the past and reflecting on the future. Though their roles had changed, their mission remained the same: to inspire others to seek harmony in a chaotic world. Looking back, neither man could have predicted where their paths would lead. A single moment of regret, a baton strike followed by forgiveness, had sparked a chain reaction that touched thousands of lives. It reminded them that even in our darkest hours, there is always hope, always a chance to grow, to connect, to heal. In the end, their story wasn't just about two individuals. It was about humanity itself, about the power of forgiveness, the strength of friendship, and the belief that no matter how broken the world may seem, we all have the ability to mend it, one small act of kindness at a time. And as long as people remembered that lesson, the ripples they created would continue to spread, reaching places they could never imagine.